Good afternoon, Mr. Premier, and thank you for having this press briefing with us. We, meaning ZJB Radio / GIU, Montserrat.
Okay, basically what happens that because we're on budgetary support, there's a requirement for a midterm review. In other words, by the end of the first half of the financial year, a review of the performance against targets which is set. And the team comes in, meets with various members of the public service and the core team dealing with the discussions to look at the budgetary performance, look at what has been happening, looking at whether or not we're meeting the targets, whether or not we're doing the things which you said we're doing. And on the basis of that, then they will make a determination as to whether or not things are going as planned. As simple as that.
There were some discussions around the targets that were set for the last financial year, and some hurdles that prevented you from meeting those targets. And what was said by the defeat team was that this year the outlook is very good in terms of revenues that the targets that you've set yourselves for this financial year.
Yeah, and which is basically what I said. You've established a budget, they've provided support, and they're reviewing to see how well you're doing as against what has been agreed. And making recommendations as to how things, what they see, and for us to give a determination. If we are below target, what do we plan to do? In the case where we have been sufficiently prudent in terms of our fiscal management, how do we then use whatever savings which we have to meet some of the shortfalls which were carried over from the previous year?
There was also some mention made about growth at 2%, I think.
The last financial year, the preliminary estimates of growth was around 4-point-something%. To a great extent, growth is measured on the basis of information being provided to the statistics department by the private sector. What has happened and what we recognize is that members of the private sector are not necessarily willing to share the information as required. And as a consequence, we may have to revise the targets because we do not have the base data to justify the growth figures that we have anticipated. Now, one can measure growth in various ways, and one of which is by budget performance in terms of revenue. Revenue is not as a consequence of increasing taxes. Revenue would be as a consequence of economic activity which takes place within a particular time period, and that could be used as a proxy for growth.
Yeah, on that same matter that you just raised, it's a matter that's always concerned me about private sector not being willing or not providing the information that we need. And how can we get that? Because I have been in forums or meetings where I hear people deliberately say, no, I will not provide that information. And it hurts me because I know that by not providing that information, we cannot get the support that we need overall as an enterprise or as a private sector to go forward. How do you think this is one can go to fix this? Because it all has to do as well with, say, our tax returns even.
Yeah, you see, part of it is the question by the private sector. Let's take, for example, the newspaper. If we ask a question on the newspaper in terms of your production, then perhaps at the back of your mind you're saying, this is a sneaky way of finding out whether or not I'm paying sufficient taxes. So therefore, I will not provide the information. And because there's no legal requirement, well, there's a legal requirement for you to provide the information, but if you do not provide the information, what recourse do we have by law? There are, in economics, there's a phrase which we use as proxy. So let's take, for example, concrete blocks. If the concrete block plan is not going to provide you with the information, then you do it on the basis of housing starts. And then you work back from housing starts in terms of the quantity of blocks which may be required to build certain numbers of houses. So there are ways and means of doing it. The question is whether or not our statistics department is willing to go the route of proxy, or based on their own training, because statisticians and economists are not necessarily the same people, that they may be saying, no, we need the hard numbers. So because we've started a process of reform, medium-term economic framework, getting documentation and data emanating from the IMF reports and so forth, that it takes a little while for people to get accustomed to doing the things that are required, because we don't have a history of operating in that manner. What I can say is that both CARTAC and the FID have given us kudos for the improvements in the data gathering and in the reporting which is being provided by government. Now, part of it is that sometimes we get caught up with this whole idea of, did you grow by 2% or 3% or 4%? Now, I have a difficulty where people tend to focus a lot on economic growth and not sufficiently on economic development. And they're two distinct features.
You said people. I said to David once, I'm so sorry. I said to David once on that question of people, and sorry for interrupting you, but I just, as I think of it, I should ask it. When you refer to people, are you talking to donor agencies, or the officials of it, or the public?
I use people in the broadest context, because the aid agencies, the donor community are all people in the strictest sense of the word. And aid agencies, development institutions tend to focus a lot on economic growth. If you look at the reports coming out of the US, you look at the reports coming out of the G20 or the G8, they all speak to economic growth. As developing countries, I think the focus should be more on economic development. Now, development here is sustainable growth created as a result of economic activity for the benefit of the people. Now, let's take, for example, if government spends a lot of money on port development, where all of the equipment are imported, and this is just taking it as an extreme example, all of the equipment is imported, all of the materials are imported, etc. Because of that capital expenditure on the part of government, it goes towards economic growth. But there's very little development other than the fact that you get a port. If, for example, and let's take, for example, the tobacco operation, a single operation of that nature, if they're employing 50 persons, then you would find 50 persons being employed. It's sustainable because next year they will still have employment and so forth. And your export earnings will also increase. So you're getting both growth and development because you're getting industrial development. Now, what's the consequence of something like that? The consequence is that those 50 persons who are employed will be able to buy utility services, they'll be able to buy food, they'll be able to buy other things, which means that government's tax revenue will increase as a consequence of that increased spending. So you'll get both growth and development as a consequence of an investment of that nature.